Okay, we are live. Good evening, everyone. Greetings of Vijay Dashmi to all, and welcome to Karwaan YouTube Live. I'm Ishan Sharma, founder of Karwaan, and with me I have two wonderful guests, Squadron Leader retired Rana Chinna sir, and author of a wonderful book, The Indian Contingent, The Forgotten Muslim Soldiers from the Battle of Dunkirk, Dr. Ghee Bowman. So, uh, Squadron Leader Rana Chinna, the chair of the discussion this evening, served in the Indian Air Force as a helicopter pilot. He is a recipient of the McGregor Medal for Best Military Reconnaissance in 1986, and he is currently secretary and editor of the United Service Institution of India Center for Military History and Conflicts Research, and vice president of the Indian Military Historical Society. He was responsible for spearheading the joint USI-MEA India and the Great War Centenary Commemoration project, and he was appointed an honorary member of the British Order of the British Empire in 2016, and an officer of the Belgian Order of Leopold in 2018 for his contributions towards strengthening Indo-UK and Indo-Belgian bilateral ties, respectively. Today, Rana sir will be in a conversation with the author, Dr. Ghee Bowman. And to take this conversation forward, I welcome Rana sir. And for those who have joined us, they can send in their questions in the live chat. We'll be doing a question answer session post the conversation between the chair and the speaker. So over to you, sir. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Ishan. And good evening to everybody who's tuned in, and happy Dussehra to all of you. To start off, I'd like to thank Ishan and the Karwaan Heritage Exploration Initiative. I think it's a wonderful it is a wonderful initiative, and I've seen some of the previous speakers, so I think we're in very exalted company. And today we will be discussing a very interesting book on an important topic, and which deals with a part of India's role during the Second World War. Now, many of us are aware, perhaps, that India had a role to play in World War II. For those of you who are actually interested, or maybe students of military history, you will be also familiar with the fact that the Indian Army had risen from about 2.5 lakhs to 2.5 million men by the end of the war. And it has, as has often been pointed out, this was an all-volunteer force, perhaps the largest volunteer force in the history of human conflict. And the Indian Army fought in almost every theater of war, from East Africa, the Middle East, North Africa, Iraq, Burma, and also what is not that well known, a small contingent of men, were perhaps the first contingent that went overseas, was a tiny force called Force K6, which was composed of 4 AT or animal transport companies of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. These were the class composition of these companies was almost entirely Punjabi Muslim. And if you recall, a few years ago, there was a film by Christopher Nolan on Dunkirk. And at that point in time, some observant people had pointed out that, by the way, there was absolutely no depiction of any Indians in that particular film. So this particular book, which is written by Dr. Ghee Bowman, actually rectifies that omission and shines a light on what is literally a forgotten chapter in India's military history. And before I go on to request Dr. Bowman to talk about the book, I'd like to briefly introduce him. He is a historian, a teacher, and a storyteller based in Exeter, England. And he's worked in theatre for NGOs and in education in the United Kingdom and around the world. And this particular book is his first, and it sprang from his research to explore Exeter's multicultural history, having found apparently 3 photos of Indian soldiers wearing pagris in Devon, which led him to carry out his research in various archives in the United Kingdom. And his 5-year-long study of the Second World War's Indian Contingent took him to 5 countries. And he has 2 daughters and lives in England. I think, Ghee, I met you when you were working on your master's on the same project, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Exactly. I was at the Imperial War Museum in the photo archive one afternoon, looking through the many photos that there are there of Force K6. And you were there for, I can't remember why you were there, but we saw each other and made a connection then. And that was very lucky that we happened to be there at the same time.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Now I do recall. So it was so I was looking for material for the India and the Great War Centenary commemoration. So I was, yes, there at that point in time. So you have an interesting name, which actually links up to, to the RIASC, because one of the key things which the ASC carried was ghee, which is clarified butter, and your name is Ghee. Does that have any connection with the book?
I wish it did. No, originally I was John. My name on my birth certificate is John Bowman, John Martin Bowman. When I was a little boy, I used to say Ghee. So my sister said, let's call him Ghee. So it was a nickname to begin with. And then eventually I changed it. But actually, I like the idea of, I like clarity. I'm a great one for clarity. So I'm okay with being called clarified butter. That's fine. I don't mind. I'm a little bit sweet. I'm a little bit fat, but I'm there for clarity.
Okay, that's good. Excellent. So Ghee, before we go on to the narrative of the story, because it is an amazing story, very briefly, what was your motivation? Why Force K6? I know that it says that you found these photographs and that's what led you to it. Was that it? Could you?
Yeah, it was. It really was. That was it. I mean, I was working on this project on trying to find the photos now on Exeter's, the multicultural history of Exeter, which is a small city in the southwest of England. And this is the book that I was looking at, Devon at War. And in that book were these 3 photos. And there they are.
Yeah.
And they're part of the Imperial War Museum collection. And they were just so interesting that I was kind of hooked by these photos. So I went to the National Archives and I got the War Service Diary of the 25th Animal Transport Company. And I sat in the National Archive and I read through this unfolding story that started in Rawalpindi to Bombay to the Suez Canal to Marseille in the south of France, and then up to the north of France. And it was just such a captivating story. I mean, it's written like a war service diary. So every day there's a new entry from the commanding officer, and it's very factual. The facts were getting really interesting, particularly as it came to May of 1940 with the German invasion and then the retreat to Dunkirk. It was just so captivating. That's what it was. For me, I like stories. So this was a story that grabbed me, a story that held me. And then the more I searched, the more I found that there were other stories that went around it, which were just as captivating and just as interesting.
So before we go on to discussing those certain aspects of those stories in greater detail, perhaps you could just run the audience through the story itself. What was it all about? Force K6, Dunkirk, the evacuation, and there's so many aspects to that which you cover in your book, chapter by chapter. So if you could just please run us through these, and then we can go on to discussing them subsequently. Sure.
And I'll show you some slides as well, if I may, Rana.
Yes, please.
Okay, so there we go. So that's, so Okay, just advance that. So they were known as the first in the field. Here's a photo of them, another one of the Imperial War Museum photos taken at the end of December 1940. The British Army in France had decided the motto was not a horse in the force. They decided that they didn't need any animal transport, and then they changed their mind. So there was no skill in the British Army at this point. There were no people who were trained for animal transport. So they needed the empire to help out. So these 4 companies came out, and they were the 22nd, the 25th, the 29th, and the 32nd animal transport companies, plus some supporting units. And they were a total of 1,723 men. They came to the south of France, to Marseille, and landed on December the 26th, 1939. And that was a very cold winter, a very harsh winter. And it must have been quite a shock for these guys. This photo was taken shortly after they'd arrived. They're smiling and they're looking happy, but I think maybe they're quite cold. Even in the south of France, they're quite cold. So the next slide is a bit of film footage. So this is from the newsreel that was, there's a long newsreel you can find on YouTube, actually. A newsreel that showed a lot of footage of these guys in France and in Britain. And so this next bit that I'm going to show you is from when they first arrived in the south of France, the end of 1939. And the voiceover is Z.A. Bukhari, who was then working for the BBC, and after the war, he was the founder of Pakistan Radio. Here we go.
जवान इस वक्त फ्रांस में पहुंचे। दिसंबर का महीना है, सख्त सर्दी पड़ रही है। खच्चर जहाज पर से उतर रहे हैं। ये बात मशहूर है कि खच्चर बहुत अड़ियल जानवर है, लेकिन ये खच्चर बहुत असील मालूम होते हैं। अरे नहीं, आजा भाई, आजा। ये
So that's right at the beginning, right when they first arrived in France. And it's a very lovely bit of footage, that, because it shows you them, shows you the men, shows you the mules, shows you what they were doing there on the dock. So each company, I'll just put, each company was 315 men and 3 officers. So the commanding officer was a major. Almost all of those were white British, but there were 2 at the beginning of the war. There were 2 of them who were Indians, and we'll talk about them later. And then most of them were drivers. So, and that of course they're not drivers of vehicles, these are mule drivers, men who have the skill to look after mules and indeed horses. And then viceroys commissioned officers, a Rissaldar in charge, 7 jemadars, which included 1 who was a medical officer and 2 who were veterinary officers. So that's an interesting ratio, that there were, twice as many who were working with the horses and the mules as with the men. And then a whole load of tradesmen and followers. So particularly a big team. So that's 20 men whose job was to do with the feet and the hooves and the horseshoes, the mule shoes. That's a big amount of men. And then all the other kind of tradesmen and followers they needed to support that group of men, so including a Maulvi. So every company had a religious advisor attached to them. So it's a little bit like a village from Punjab, with everything that would need, the cooks, the cleaners, everything taken up from Punjab and transplanted into France. But of course, no women, no children in that village. So rather unusual in that regard. But really, so that also meant that there was a very strong sense that they were well supported within that unit, and a very strong sense of unit cohesion within that unit as well. So there's these 4 companies. This is a nice photo that shows them at play, at rest. So this is 4 months later. This is just before the Germans attacked, in fact, north of France, right up in the far north of of France, in the sector where the British Army was deployed, and they're having a gymkhana. Every Sunday, apparently, they had a gymkhana like this, and there was trick riding on the backs of the mules, and there was music and dancing. So they were dancing Bhangra here in the north of France in 1940. And the photo shows the children, the French children sitting on the laps, and everyone is clearly getting on very well. And that's a kind of, that photo is typical, I think, of the lots of other photos and lots of other descriptions I've heard of how well they got on with civilians in their time in France and then in Britain. And then May the 10th, so just two and a half weeks later, after that photo was taken, the Germans attacked in very large numbers in this Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, that quickly overran the Netherlands and Belgium and northern France, and most of the British army was cut off and had to be evacuated via this little port of Dunkirk, which is in the very north of France. And then, so of the four companies, the 32nd Company and the 25th Company left France through Dunkirk. The 29th Company and all the other units went out later, about 2 weeks later, by a place called Saint-Nazaire, which is in the west of France. And the 22nd Company became prisoners of war. I'll tell you a bit more about them in a minute. And there were 5 men killed at that time. And the 25th Company, so this was one of their officers. So this is Major Mohammed Akbar Khan, and I can tell you more about him if you like. So on the 28th, by the 28th of May, they had marched from Lille. So this is the same company that we saw in the photo watching the gymkhana. They marched to the sea, and by the 28th of May, they had reached the sea, and then they came to this, so if you've seen the film Dunkirk, the film that you referred to by Christopher Nolan, you can imagine the scenes of devastation, and carnage and slaughter on that beach, with the German Air Force flying their dive bombers, the Stukas, over, with the shelling coming in, and the ships that were coming in to try and take them off the beach being attacked as well. So really, a really awful scene. And then on the afternoon of the 28th of May, through the middle of that, this man, Major Mohammed Akbar Khan, he was in fact the only Indian officer on the beach at Dunkirk, him marching along the beach with 300 men behind him. Whether they were marching in step, I don't know. Whether they were kind of in formation, I'm not sure. But certainly they went along the beach, and they were taken off the mole, which is a sort of key. They were taken off that in the middle of the night in several different ships, and arrived back in England the next morning, the 29th of May. And there's one story that Major Akbar tells in his autobiography. He says that they got to Dover and they got to the station, the railway station, and there were the women from the voluntary service waiting with sandwiches and cups of tea and so on. And I can imagine the men took the sandwiches and looked inside very carefully, and perhaps weren't too happy about if there was ham inside the sandwich. But they drank the cups of tea, and they were tired, they were dirty, they were hungry, they were full of the terrible stress of what they'd been through for several days. And then they went to the women and they said, "Can we borrow your trays, please? Can we borrow your teapots, please?" And they started to make music on the station at the railway station at Dover. They started to make some music and they started to dance. And it was so attractive and such a wonderful thing to do that all the British soldiers started to join in as well as the civilians at the railway station. And I think that's just a wonderful idea that they were so tired and dirty and hungry and worn out, and yet they wanted to dance. These are Punjabi men. They wanted to dance. So they're back in England, or rather they're in England. Whoops. And so this photo was taken a bit later. This shows them in Scotland. And 3 more companies came out to join them. So there were now 6 companies. So initially there were 4. 1 went in the prisoner of war camp. 3 more came out. And they stayed then in Britain until 1944. So this was quite another 3.5 years. And they were posted in Cornwall and Wales and Scotland, so mostly in the mountainous areas, like in this photograph. And the reason for that was that they were training for mountain warfare in Norway. And this was an expedition, an operation that was an idea of Winston Churchill's, but it never actually happened. So they were in training along with a lot of infantry brigades for an operation that didn't happen. I'm going to show you another bit of film. This is summer of 1940. So this is a few weeks after they'd arrived in Britain. And this is in a town called Ashbourne, which is in the middle of England. And they are, it's from the same newsreel, so it's the same commentary. And here they are meeting some special guests.
अब जवान अपनी कामयाबी की दुआ मांगने के लिए खुद खुदा के दरबार में हाजिर हुए हैं। कुछ जवान तंबू खड़ा कर रहे हैं। मिस्टर तंबू खड़े हो गए। ये तंबू किस लिए है? अखबार पढ़ने के लिए? जी नहीं। जी हाँ, इक्का। साफे की सफाई, सर की सफाई कैंची से, सर की सफाई हाथ से। लात ना मारना भाई, ना भाई खच्चर। किसी बड़ी हस्ती के तशरीफ लाने की तैयारियां हो रही हैं। बादशाह सलामत और मलिका साहिबा मुआयने के लिए तशरीफ लाना चाहते हैं। ये मेजर मोहम्मद अकबर खान साहब हैं। बादशाह सलामत तशरीफ ले आए। ये रिसालदार मेजर मोहम्मद अशरफ खान साहब हैं। मौलवी साहिबान नजराना पेश कर रहे हैं। ये जवान अपनी खुशकिस्मती पर जितना भी नाज करें बजा है। ये मुलाकात बहुत देर तक याद रहेगी।
There we are. I think that's absolutely fascinating, that footage, and really interesting how it shows these guys, you know, they're in the heart of England. There they are, meeting the king, meeting the queen, and kind of sharing the kind of defense of this country at a really difficult time, sharing in the defense with the British soldiers and all the others as well. So I'm talking for a very long time, Rana. I don't know if you want to interject a question, or shall I keep going?
Well, no, you do go on. I noticed this appears to be a photograph from a German archive, so I presume this is the one that's the company that went into captivity.
Exactly.
So go ahead. Let's just introduce people to the broader story, and then we can just pick up some of the finer details after that.
Okie dokie, yeah. So the 22nd Company then, so they were posted right in the north of France near the city of Metz, near the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line was a big, reinforced, extremely strong concrete armored wall along the north and the northeast of France, all along the border with Germany, which the French had constructed in the 1930s. And the idea was that this would protect the French, that they wouldn't need any other protection. And so these guys from the 22nd Company were attached to the 51st Highland Division of the British Army, which was put there in the middle of this kind of French army. And they were cut off when the Germans attacked. And so they were it was really unclear what they should do. So they eventually decided that they would, and their commanding officer decided that they would march southeastwards and try and get to Switzerland. So they marched for several days along the River Moselle, and eventually they were captured in the middle of June. They were captured by the Germans. And this photograph was taken just a few days later. This photograph shows them marching along. At this stage, they've lost all their mules and their carts, and they're just carrying their equipment with them. And I don't know how well it shows in this photo, but one of the accounts of this says that they were all carrying hockey sticks. Because they were keen hockey players, and so they were using their hockey sticks as a way to carry their bundles on the back. Perhaps that's on the next photo. Let me just. No, you can't see the hockey stick on that. But anyway, so this, and this chap on the right is Hexley, Tom Hexley, who was a very famous guy who was at this stage a warrant officer attached to them. Anyway, so they were captured. They went into prisoners of war camps. They were separated. The officers and the VCOs were separated from the other men. And the other men then spent several weeks in very awful conditions in the north of France in very, very large prisoner of war camps, because the German army was dealing with hundreds of thousands of French prisoners of war at this stage. Then things settled down a bit, and they went into more permanent prisoner of war camps. So there were about 320 of them in the POW camps. They were the first Indians to be in prisoner of war camps during the war, and some of them spent nearly 5 years in camps. So they may well have been the Indian soldiers to spend the longest period ever in a POW camp. And some of them escaped. So Tom Hexley here, the white guy, he escaped. Jemedar Jahan Dad, he escaped. Quite a few others, and there's some very interesting stories among the escaping stories. And about 30 of them joined the German army. So this was Subhash Chandra Bose, who later went on to form an army, the Indian National Army in Burma, with Indian prisoners of war fighting on the same side as the Japanese. Before he did that, he was in Europe recruiting Indian prisoners of war to fight with the Germans. And some of the guys from the 22nd Company joined that unit. I'll just skip over these and show you, where are they? There we go. So these two photos are from the, what was called the Legion Freyas Indian, or the Free, also known as, the 950th Regiment of the German Army. The photo on the right shows a couple of soldiers, I think they're both Sikhs. This is in the Netherlands, so that's where they were posted initially, and then later on they were posted in the southwest of France. And the photo on the left shows their hockey team. In that hockey team is Abu Zar, who was a very famous member of the 22nd Company, who then joined the German army. And that's another story that is really not very well known about either in Europe or in India, is that there was this small, around 1,500 men, I think in total, who joined the German army and didn't fight very much, but certainly were trained and given uniforms like the Germans. But I'm just going to tell you about this. Where is he? Oh, this man. So this is Captain Anis Ahmed Khan. He was a captain in the 22nd Company. He had been in the army since the 1920s. He was trained at Sandhurst, which is where British Army officers are trained. He was captured with the rest of that company and spent nearly 5 years in the German POW camp as an officer. And those are some of the camps that he was held at. And Bose tried to recruit him into the Legion, into the Free Indian Legion, and he said no. So he said, you know, that he had tasted the king's salt and he couldn't be disloyal to the king because of that, even though he was a nationalist. And you know, there is of course, a strong argument that would say that if you were an Indian nationalist of whatever sort, whatever rank, whatever background, you know, that actually it makes sense not to fight for the British, but to fight against the British. But that was the decision that he made and he stuck to. And then after the war, he went on and he stayed with the Indian Army rather than the Pakistan Army, and he became the director of supplies and transport. And there's a long story about him, and I was very lucky to meet his daughter, who told me lots of really interesting things about him. So I guess that's probably the outline of the story as a whole. That's the kind of the main overview. You know, in 1944, the beginning of 1944, the rest of them went back to India, where they were then, a lot of them were posted to Burma, where they were working with the 14th Army there, and some of them continued in India. And of course, by the end of the war, animal transport had proved to be essential in many different theatres.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for covering, covering such a broad canvas and giving us an overview of what these soldiers experienced. One quick question: so, why were they brought in at the beginning? Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Why bring these 480 companies all the way from India to the United Kingdom?
So they were. I haven't shown you a photo of them, but initially when they arrived, they were using their mules as draft animals. So you'd have two mules together with a cart behind it. And the job was to do supply and transport at the front line and at the places of on the chain of on the line of transport where things would change from one transport to another. So in the port, for example, it's sometimes useful to have carts like that, and they were very busy at Marseille. Equally, on the front line, when it was muddy or when it was very steep, or when they required when it was required to be quiet, because of course a vehicle makes a lot of noise and a mule doesn't. That's when they were needed. So there were these 4 companies from India. There were also 2 animal transport companies from Cyprus as well, who were being used to supply different parts of the British Army. And that's, as I say, there was a skills gap in the British Army. There was none of this skill or this equipment was held any longer.
Right. So my understanding is that after the First World War, people realized that horse cavalry and the animal was on its way out, and mechanization was the buzzword. So everybody was going in for technology and motor transport. But when push came to shove, they realized that there were areas that wheeled transport could not go, and you needed animal transport for that. And by that time, I think the British Army had lost, as you mentioned, the skills to work with the military mule or with animal transports, which is why it was essential to bring these soldiers in. Now, when they were in England, they received a lot of attention, as is very obvious. They were the focus of a sustained media campaign, whether in articles, photographs, films. It was quite remarkable, and there was a reason for that also, I think, because at the time that they arrived, it was in many ways a very dark time for England. France had fallen, the Battle of Britain was beginning, the Blitz had started. So I think it was very important to showcase that the arrival of these men and to tell the British public that, look, Britain is not alone, but it's the Empire troops stand with them. And these were very distinctive troops, you know, they were tall men with their turbans and very distinctive appearance. So I think there was a very strong propaganda element to that. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think there was always, even from the beginning, there was a sense that there was two reasons that they were there. They were there for a military purpose and they were there for a propaganda purpose. I mean, the fact that there was a film crew there when they unloaded their ships, and not only a film crew, but also, you know, reporters and photographers from around the world. I mean, the stories came out right at the beginning, at the beginning of 1940. You know, they were reporting in the Times of India, and they were reporting in the Times in London, but they were also in the New York Times, and they were also in newspapers in New Zealand, you know, so it was all the way around the world. Was this, you know, this kind of news, you know, the empire is together, you know, here they come 7,000 miles to help us, you know, we're all standing together against the Nazis. So absolutely, there was always an idea, propaganda was always there.
And you meant, so, but there was, as you mentioned, another reason also for holding them back in England. Part of which was, of course, to retrain the British Army in the use of the military mule. But there was another operational reason as well. Would you want to just touch upon that? Why would they kept back?
Yeah, so Operation Jupiter, it was called, and it was a plan that never happened. So by the middle of 1941, Hitler, the Nazis were fighting against the Soviet Union, against the Russians as well. And so Britain started to supply the Russians by ship, which went around the coast of Norway. And the Germans disrupted those convoys, those very, very cold Arctic convoys. They disrupted them by attacking them with aircraft from bases in Norway. And so Churchill's idea was to land some infantry brigades in the north of Norway to take those airfields and hold them. And then possibly even, he said, unroll the map of Europe from the north. And they, in order to operate in that snowy environment, they would need animal transport. That was the idea. It was only Churchill who actually thought it was a good idea. All of his his planners and his staff said, they weren't in favor of it. Nevertheless, the planning happened and the training went on for quite a long period of time. And so these guys became they spent a lot of their time in mountainous areas in Scotland and in Wales, working in the snow. Some of them were even posted to Iceland, where they were training, working with the Arctic, what was called the Snow and Mountain Warfare Training Centre in Aviemore in Scotland. And going out in really terrible conditions. I mean, one of them in October 1942, they were doing an expedition on the big mountains around Aviemore, and one of them died of exposure there. He froze to death on the side of the mountain. It was, so that's what they were. That was the kind of conditions they were working in.
But insofar as their supplies and clothing and all the rest were concerned, I don't think those were adequate by and large, were they not? Yes, I think so. Certainly their supplies were good enough. The food supplies was good enough. And I think they were well enough equipped. I mean, I think it was, and I guess Punjab, some of these, the majority of them were from Punjab. Some of them were from the northwest frontier, some of them from Kashmir as well. So some of them were used to mountains. It wasn't necessarily such a strange environment for them. But I think those environments, like those kind of mountains in the winter, are tough for anybody, regardless of where you come from. But one thing which struck me when I was reading the book were the parallels with the experience of Indian soldiers in Europe in World War I and what happens with Force K6 in World War II. And this is on two levels. One is, the first Indian troops to arrive in the United Kingdom were those that were part of Indian Expeditionary Force A, which landed in at Marseille, at the same port in September 1914, September and October. And they went on to plug the gap at Ypres, again, to support the BEF and try and halt the German advance, which they managed to do in World War I, but in World War II, of course, the BEF is overwhelmed. So the first Indians that actually arrived in England in the First World War were casualties, were wounded men who come and are taken to the Royal Pavilion at Brighton and a series of other hospitals around that part of the United Kingdom. The remarkable thing, of course, is that those men found that there was a marked difference between the attitude of the average Briton on the street, who met them very warmly and were very kind and very, generous, and the official kind of attitude that they encountered from officials who were, what they used to call old India hands. So much so that the hospitals in and around Brighton were literally turned into prison camps or jails because they weren't allowed to leave the grounds unsupervised. There was this great fear of intermingling with English women, and so all kinds of restrictions were imposed upon them. But in the Second World War, perhaps it's a measure of the changed circumstances, changed social attitudes. There is very little, if any, of that kind of restriction imposed on them. And these men not only intermingle, but as you have documented, they actually form some very long-lasting relationships, not just with families, but with individual women, and even go on to have children with them in a number of cases. So would you like to just comment on that?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you draw that parallel between the First World War and the Second World War, and the difference, and I'm not entirely sure why there was such a big difference. It's 25 years is the difference in time. Clearly, people in Britain do feel differently about India, and the official attitude is different toward India. And I think that's the big difference, as you've outlined. So that when these guys were coming, they were allowed to go freely around the country, on their leave. They were allowed to travel fairly freely. They were allowed to go, they were often going through London, going to their rest centre in Woking, at the mosque there. And the official, they were invited to lots of tea parties and so on. And so it is quite different. And I think you're probably right that it's down to what has changed over the 25 years. And the part of that is the sense that even here, I think in Britain, the sense that India is on a path to independence. That this is no longer, it's a different relationship between the two countries, between the governments, and therefore a different relationship between the people. Gandhi had been in Britain in the 1930s, visiting the mills in the north. There was around 10,000, they reckon, around 10,000 Indians living in Britain by this stage, a number of whom were, doctors and intellectuals and artists and all sorts of people. Mulk Raj Anand himself, he wrote about the experience of the First World War, of the sepoys in France, based around his father's experience. And during the war, he was here in Britain as well. So yeah, there's a sense that the British public and the British official view had grown up, perhaps, in its attitude towards India and Indian people, and in this case, towards Indian soldiers. So yeah, and the relationships they made, just lots of wonderful stories. A new story that I learned about just 2 weeks ago about how one soldier met a girl in the west of England in a town called Ross-on-Wye. He was a veterinary sepoy, and how he eventually asked permission to leave the army and did so, and got married and stayed with this woman for 47 years until he died in 1990, and only once went back to Punjab. Just an extraordinary story. Just levels of relationship that were close relationships that were formed that really, were quite really surprising but also very, very deep.
Which brings me to another point, Ghee, because I think your book is remarkable from the point of view of the sources that you use. Obviously you use archival sources. But I think you made quite a extraordinary, I would say, attempt to go out into the field and you actually trace down descendants of these men's families, both in Pakistan, and also managed to find human interest stories within the United Kingdom. And how on earth did you manage to do that?
I thank you for saying that. I mean, how did I manage to do it? I became a detective, really. I followed little clues, and I did an enormous amount of research in archives, on the internet, in newspapers, and I followed everything. I followed up everything that I could find. In some ways, here in the UK, it was easier, because if there's ever a mention of Indian soldiers in Britain in the Second World War, it's almost certainly these guys. So I just had to kind of follow that through. I think I was motivated, I think, by the project that I was doing when I discovered this story, the project about Exeter's multicultural history. We were doing these twin tracks of research in the archives and talking to people. And what I found was, in my opinion, that stories are much richer when you bring those two things together. When you've got some kind of solid grounding of the basics, the outline of what happened that comes from the documents, and then you've got the personal testimony, which brings it alive and makes it human. And I think people, that's in my opinion, people like to read and they like to hear stories and they respond to stories. And I think, therefore, my style of history is to try and find those stories and then to share those stories as well as I can in a way that will bring in and engage an ordinary reader, somebody who's not a specialist. When I wrote the book, I had very much had non-specialists in mind, both in South Asia and in Britain.
So the sources, I was going to ask you about how, it slipped my mind, but I'll come back to that. One of the other things which I thought it would be, I should comment upon, because, when we advertised the talk on our social media, and we actually got one or two rather indignant responses saying, commenting on the name of the book. And the comment was, why does the book say that we are commemorating only, it says, the forgotten Muslim soldiers of the Battle of Dunkirk. Mm-hmm. And the point that was raised was that, in the Indian Army, we don't really do faith-based commemoration. Commemoration is always for all the soldiers who fought and died. And that's the way we view things over here. So I understand that, I know that, in the United Kingdom and you make a point about that towards the end in your last chapter, and you do talk about multicultural Britain and some of the factors that perhaps went into, well, the reasons why you structured the book and you focused on this particular aspect that is on the Islamic identity of these soldiers. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it's a question that needs to be addressed. So firstly, I should say that 97.7% of the men in Force K6 were Muslims. So I've done a lot of work in finding names and finding records, and I found about 2,200 out of around 4,000 names, and almost all of them are Muslims. As the war went on, there were more and more non-Muslims. So, for example, there are a number of Sikh officers, and I could tell you about Ratan Singh, for example, or Gyan Kapoor, who was the accountant who was a Hindu from Lahore. He was the accountant for Force K6. And their stories are in the book as well, to some extent. But the reason for the title, really, is partly that this book was designed to be attractive in India and in Pakistan and in Britain. So, you know, it's going across cultures and across countries, but also because, as you say, you know, the issue that we have here in Britain is Islamophobia. You know, in Britain, Sikhs and Hindus are you know, generally speaking, I would say not, you know, they are not, they are welcome, they are, you know, integrated in, but Muslims, whether they are South Asian Muslims or Muslims from other parts of the world, are still seen in a lot of cases as being an enemy, as being the other, as being terrorists, as being evil. And so when people find that there were, you know, this particular unit, and that they were in Britain, and that they were going to, you know, the mosque in Woking and other mosques, that they were eating halal meat, that they were slaughtering themselves, that they were celebrating Eid and observing the fast at Ramadan and so on. When people find this out, it's a big surprise. It's a big, you know, oh wow, here are, you know, meeting the king and queen. Here are these Muslims right in the heart of British society during this really, as you say, stressful, difficult time, and along, you know, being alongside British soldiers and British civilians, and being alongside with absolutely no problems at all, and making these close relationships and making these friendships and integrating one with the other. And I think that's really the main reason why the book has the title that it does. It's about addressing, a British question, really.
Well, thank you. I think that's, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that clarification. And I just remembered the question that I was going to ask you earlier when we were talking about sources, and it slipped my mind. You know, one of the primary sources that historians turn to when they're looking at the experience of Indian soldiers in Europe in the First World War is this collection of censors' letters, which is available in at the British Library. Now, is there anything similar for Force K6, where you, you know, apart from the war diaries and perhaps the interrogation reports, what else is there?
I wish there were those censored letters, or those censored reports rather. No, I mean, there are censored reports from the Second World War. And there is one, for example, from North Africa, which includes a short quote from one of the prisoners of war in Germany, who was in the 22nd Company. But there isn't that, no, unfortunately, that body of censored letters doesn't exist. So there are letters. I've come across a few letters. Recently, this person that I met a couple of weeks ago actually came up with lots of, I think I might even have the folder, lots of letters from Indian soldiers during and just after the war, which is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And then a few, like Major Akbar himself, he wrote some letters to Amory, who was the Secretary of State for India, and just really odd letters, but nowhere near that same amount of stuff. So the voice of the sepoy itself is harder to find. I mean, one other thing that there is a newsletter. They had a regular weekly newsletter, Wilayati Akbar Haftawa, which was produced in Britain, written in Urdu, but in Romanized Urdu, which was mostly written by a retired colonel in the army, so a white British guy. But there were things in there that were written by some of the soldiers. So, for example, there's one article by a guy called Nawazish Ali, who then I subsequently met his daughter, who lives in Punjab in Pakistan, and she had a book of poems that he had written, and that was the most wonderful discovery. A whole book of poems written in this Siharfi form, in a dialect of Punjabi, and poems that told about his experience in the war, a tiny little bit about his experience in Britain, and more about his experience in Burma, which was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, the sources were hard to find, but also that makes it, that's part of the adventure, if you like, is trying to track things down. And that also that wonderful sense that I have now, that people still come to me, like happened just a few 3 weeks ago. People come to me and they say, look, have you seen this? Have you heard this story? And I say, oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, no, well, fantastic, because you're absolutely right. The sources is a huge problem for anybody who's working on the Indian Army, which is why I think your book is so important, because for the first time it's shining a light on South Asian soldiers as, more than just mere automations or regimental numbers or just names without a face. It's giving them agency. It's making them human. So thank you for that. You did talk about was he then Major Anis or Captain?
Captain at the beginning of the war, Major when he came out. Yeah.
Came out, yeah, and the question of nationalism, but I think. As Auchinleck himself mentioned in that secret memo of his in 44, and he said that any Indian officer worth his salt today is a nationalist. So the British recognized that the writing was on the wall. I mean, there was no two ways about it. And I personally have spoken to a lot of KCIOs when they were still around, ICOs. Well, particularly the KCIOs, because they came from a different strata of society, as Captain Anis did. His cousin, who you talk about in the book, later General, then Major Shahid Hamid.
Shahid, yeah.
Yeah, Shahid Hamid. So I mean, he was the aide-de-camp or staff officer towards the end of the war. Anyhow, so they all came from a very, let's say, upper crust of Indian society. And a lot of them said that, when the war broke out and the whole Quit India movement happened, or even before that, they said we would interact with Indian political leaders and ask them, what should we do? Should we side with the British? And the answer that they got, whether it was Gandhi or Nehru, and I think even Jinnah, was that, look, India is soon going to be free, and free India will need an army, will need an armed force. So you must stay in your profession and continue. So, and again, so this is one of the parallels that we talk about in the First World War. The Germans again use Islam or political Islam as a kind of a tool to subvert the loyalty of Indian or Muslim soldiers, and they try the same trick, interestingly enough, in the Second World War. The only difference between the first and the second is, of course, that by the time the second rolls out, you have the pressure has built up. It's a totally different kettle of fish from the first, and that would require a session for itself. But all that I would say is that, at the end of the day, and ultimately, as you rightly point out in your book, the soldiers that fought for the Raj found themselves on the wrong end of history. Nobody talks about them, nobody remembers them. And many in South Asia will actually, kind of look down upon their role. without realizing that it is these same soldiers that went on to serve the armies of the independent South Asia after independence, because an army doesn't drop out of the tree. It takes decades, if not centuries, to build up. So, so I think we do ourselves a disservice when we take the populist view and we say, no, this is not part of our history. This is all very much a part of our history, and I think it's very important that we recognize it. We've run out of time, Ghee. Hang on, I think let me just check if there's a. So there are no questions. I think today is Dussehra, so maybe we've. People are celebrating the festival, but it's been a fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed the book. This, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are watching, is the book, and I would strongly urge you to pick it up. It's very readable. It's a human story more than a military history. So it's it's an easy read, and he's a good storyteller. Like his dad, by the way. His father was the author of what became if I'm not mistaken, a kind of a cult book amongst mountaineers, The Ascent of Ramdoodle. Am I right?
That's absolutely right. Yes, I haven't got a copy near me, I don't think, but yeah, that's right. My father wrote that book. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning.
So I think you've inherited his genes. So thank you very much, Ghee. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. It's been really good to have your authoritative and educated eye on the book, and it's been a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Thank you, and I'd also like to thank once again Ishan and the Karwaan Heritage Exploration Initiative for giving us this platform. Thank you, Ishan. It's been a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Rana sir. Thank you so much, Dr. Bowman. And I would also like to thank United Service Institution of India and Pan Macmillan, the publisher of this beautiful book, for allowing us to do this conversation in collaboration. And we look forward to many such collaborations. And for our viewers, if you like the conversation, like the video, comment down below and do share it. And if you want more such conversations in future, please subscribe to Karwaan. And once again, thanks to both our speakers for this wonderful conversation. Truly an honor it was to host both of